This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. An infamous cold case is heating up this morning. In Boston today, authorities are set to reveal a, quote, major development in the more than 40-year-long hunt for the Boston Strangler. Let's listen in.
Coakley, right to my left and behind me, Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis, Assistant District Attorney Pat Hagan, First Assistant District Attorney in Suffolk County, Superintendent-Chief Daniel Linsky, Assistant Attorney General John Verna. John is the head of the Criminal Bureau. And where's Billy Dugan up here? Bill?
Billy, come on up.
Why don't you come on up? Sergeant Detective William Dugan, who heads the Boston Police Cold Case Squad. And Don Hayes, would like Don to please come up as well. Just file over here, Don, if you would. Don. Bill, why don't you come up here, too? So that's the assembled team here. Today, we announce a major development in the investigation into the homicide of 19-year-old Mary Sullivan almost 50 years ago. Mary Sullivan was raped and murdered, and her body was desecrated in the bedroom of her Charles Street apartment sometime on the afternoon of January 4th, 1964. Mary was, as I mentioned, 19 years old, a sister, a daughter, a friend to so many. It was the last of 11 murders that would be attributed to the confessed Boston Strangler, Albert Henry DeSalvo. For almost 5 decades, the only link between Albert DeSalvo and Mary Sullivan's murder was his confession. That confession has been the subject of skepticism and controversy from almost the moment it was given. It was not admissible in court, and when DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison for a series of non-fatal sexual assaults and not the Strangler homicides, there was no forensic evidence to link Albert DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder until today. Advances in the sensitivity of DNA testing have allowed us to make a familial match between biological evidence recovered from the crime scene and a suspect in Mary Sullivan's murder. That suspect is Albert DeSalvo. Yesterday, a Suffolk Superior Court judge authorized the exhumation of DeSalvo's remains for confirmatory testing that we expect will prove DeSalvo's guilt once and for all. I want to make clear that these developments bear only on Mary Sullivan's murder. They don't apply to the other 10 homicides popularly attributed to the Boston Strangler. Even among experts and law enforcement officials, there is disagreement to this day about whether they were in fact committed by the same person. At this point in time, 50 years removed from those deaths, and without the biological evidence that we have in the Sullivan case, that's a question that we cannot answer. But these developments give us a glimmer of hope that there can one day be finality, if not accountability, for the families of the 10 other women murdered so cruelly in Boston and Cambridge, Lawrence, Lynn, and Salem between 1962 and 1963. I'll briefly summarize the evidentiary developments that bring us to this point today. DNA evidence was undreamt of in the 1960s, but even then, investigators believed that the killer had left biological evidence at the crime scene. Specifically, they recovered seminal fluid from Mary Sullivan's body and a blanket on which her body was found. In the late 1990s, Boston police criminalists attempted to extract a DNA profile from the stains on the blanket. At that point, the crime lab was unable to extract DNA that was useful for comparison. Another round of testing took place in 2000 and in 2001 when the samples taken from Mary Sullivan's body at the time of her autopsy were tested. Again, efforts to extract a usable DNA profile was unsuccessful. The nature of these tests was such that each attempt to extract DNA consumed the entire sample, meaning that it would be unavailable for further testing in the future. And for that very reason, Don Hayes, the director of the Boston Police Crime Laboratory, ordered that all further testing be halted immediately. Today, we can say beyond any doubt that Don showed tremendous foresight. That decision meant that the remaining evidence would be stored under laboratory conditions until the technology advanced and the answers locked within could be reached. Last year, after a nationally recognized laboratory reported success in obtaining DNA profiles from decades-old samples, the Boston Police Crime Lab notified investigators and the police commissioner that renewed testing using the latest techniques could likely succeed where early attempts had failed. So last fall, the slides from Miss Mary Sullivan's body and the cuttings taken from the blanket were sent to Cellmark and Bodie Technology Laboratories, two highly respected independent laboratories. And unbeknownst to one another, separate technicians at these two outstanding laboratories were able to develop DNA profiles from the samples we sent them. I want to be clear on this point. The evidence in this case never changed, but the ability, the scientific ability to use that evidence has surpassed every hope and expectation of investigators who were first assigned to the case. The stains from the blanket cuttings contain the unique genetic profile of an unknown male. The samples recovered from Mary Sullivan's body contained a mixture of two genetic profiles, one belonging to Mary herself, the other belonging to the same unidentified male whose DNA was extracted from the blanket. Given the facts and circumstances of this case, there can be no doubt that the male DNA belongs to the individual who murdered and raped Mary Sullivan. These results are unprecedented in the history of this case. For the first time ever, law enforcement has a piece of evidence to test against a suspect. Because he admitted to killing Mary Sullivan, because he described this attack in detail to his attorney and to investigators, and because certain details of the crime are similar to sexual assaults for which he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, we started with Albert DeSalvo as the lead suspect. Through late last year and the better part of this spring, homicide detectives assigned to the Boston Police Cold Case Squad, along with Suffolk County prosecutors and prosecutors from Attorney General Coakley's office, undertook an exhaustive search for any surviving evidence that might bear DeSalvo's DNA for comparison. They worked with the Department of Correction, which had custody of Albert DeSalvo from his 1967 convictions until the time of his murder in prison. They worked with the state police and the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office, which investigated and prosecuted his 1973 homicide. I'm not sure if that's correct, when he was in Walpole State Prison. They worked with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, which consolidated a county-based medical examiner system decades after DeSalvo's body was autopsied, all without success. They obtained a pair of letters that DeSalvo had sent to parole and prison officials and tried to extract from the glue on the envelopes a DNA profile. Again, those efforts were unsuccessful. But among the most recent advances in DNA testing technology is the comparison of Y chromosomes, which are passed down almost unchanged from father to son. Male descendants of the same father share nearly identical Y chromosomes, which can be compared through testing of biological material. Bearing this in mind and having exhausted every other avenue of inquiry, Boston police retrieved a water bottle that one of Albert DeSalvo's nephews drank from and discarded. That bottle was sent to Cellmark Laboratory, where technicians once again were able to develop a DNA profile. The Y chromosome from that profile was a familial match with the Y chromosome from the sample taken from Mary Sullivan's killer. That match implicates Albert DeSalvo and excludes 99.9% of others in the male population. This is good evidence, strong evidence, and reliable evidence, but it is not sufficient to close the case with absolute certainty. Many of you have covered what we call CODIS hit cases, in which an unknown suspect is identified when DNA from a crime scene matches that of a known offender in the combined DNA index system database. Even in those cases, when we get an exact match between crime scene evidence and a stored sample, we still take the additional step of getting another sample directly from the offender to confirm the match. And this case is no different. To confirm the results that we have obtained thus far, we need a sample that can be established as Albert DeSalvo's, and that has to be maintained with a clear chain of custody under the stringent controls we demand in all homicide investigations. Towards that end, Suffolk prosecutors from the Attorney General's office, and the Boston Police met with a Superior Court judge yesterday and obtained a search warrant authorizing the exhumation of Albert DeSalvo's remains for further testing. As I stated earlier, the exact number of homicides attributable to the Boston Strangler remains controversial. We don't claim with certainty that Albert DeSalvo is a suspect in each of them, but we do believe that we stand on the threshold of unprecedented certainty regarding Mary Sullivan's murder. Finally, although this is a historic moment for the law enforcement agencies involved, I want to recognize the civilians also involved and who it most directly affects. First and foremost are Diane Dodd and Casey Sherman, Mary Sullivan's sister and nephew, respectively. In many ways, they kept this case alive through the decades, through their perseverance and their commitment to finding the truth. I also want to acknowledge the DeSalvo family, who did nothing wrong, but who found themselves in the shadow of accusations that could never be fully proven or discounted. Police and prosecutors met with representatives of the families today to explain our findings and next steps. It was difficult in some ways, but I hope it sets the stage for closure that has eluded them for more than twice as long as Mary Sullivan lived on this earth. Now I'd like to introduce Attorney General Martha Coakley for some comments.
We've been listening to a news conference by Boston authorities regarding a key development in the Boston Strangler case. DNA evidence has now conclusively linked the last crime believed committed by the Boston Strangler to the man who was originally believed to have been guilty but never proven so. We're going to bring in Aaron Kotursky now to recap a little bit of what we have heard. Aaron, really interesting update here. Essentially, the last victim, Mary Sullivan, was believed to have been raped and murdered by Albert DeSalvo, but until today, there was never any physical evidence linking the two.
And here, Ty, 50 years after that rape and murder, what prosecutors in Boston now believe to be definitive evidence, DNA, all these years later, and they are prepared now to exhume the body of Albert DeSalvo in order to make that proof certain. It is really an extraordinary event in a case that is one of Boston's most notorious, indeed, maybe one of the most notorious crime scenes ever and serial killers ever. The Boston Strangler, responsible for roughly a dozen murders around Boston between 1962 and 1964. Albert DeSalvo, as you heard the prosecutor say, confessed, but was never allowed into court. So he was sentenced on lesser crimes. He died in 1973, and now they're ready to exhume his body.
Now, Aaron, as you mentioned, it has been 50 years, and they took some pains to explain why it has taken this long to get a DNA link. Tell us about that.
Well, finally, DNA testing is to the point where it's sensitive enough to actually get some conclusive results. And we've seen this in other cases. In fact, they're still using new and updated DNA technology to identify 9/11 victims. So this technology is always evolving, and it's getting ever more sensitive. And it's finally to the point now where they can take a sample off, say, as you heard the prosecutor here, a water bottle, and then compare it with other samples and finally exhume the body of Albert DeSalvo to be sure.
All right, and certainly they did point out that they are only linking this particular case, and there has been disagreement over the years whether all of these so-called Boston Strangler victims were the victims of the same person. But certainly in this case, once they exhume that body, they believe they're going to be able to finally close the case. ABC's Aaron Petersky, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an ABC News Digital Special Report. I'm Ty Hernandez in New York.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.